Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I started trade school in September to learn electrical work. My dad had been an electrician for 20 years and convinced me it was good, steady work. The program was intense, but I enjoyed learning something practical with my hands. Most of my classmates were decent people trying to build better lives for themselves. But there was this one girl who seemed to think the whole thing was a joke. Her name was actually Karen, which felt perfect later on. She came from money and was only there because her parents cut off her credit cards after she dropped out of college for the third time. She made it clear she thought she was better than everyone else. But what really got to me was how she'd call me names. Her favorite word was dyke. She'd use it like it was my actual name. When I walked into the workshop in the morning, she'd say, "There goes the dyke." When I answered questions correctly in class, she'd mutter about the smart dyke. If I wore my hair up, she'd comment on my dyke haircut. She thought it was absolutely hilarious. Her little group of friends would giggle along with her. I tried ignoring it at first. My mom had always told me that bullies lose interest if you don't give them a reaction. But Karen wasn't losing interest. If anything, my silence seemed to encourage her. She started getting bolder with her comments. She'd say them loud enough for the whole class to hear. During our lunch break, she'd point me out to people from other programs. She once told a group of welding students that the electrical program had hired a dyke as their mascot. My friends in the program started getting upset on my behalf. There was this guy from my morning lab who offered to talk to her. My study partner said she'd report Karen to the instructors, but I kept telling them to leave it alone. I didn't want to be the person who couldn't handle some immature comments. Besides, Karen's dad apparently donated money to the school, so I figured nothing would come of a complaint anyway. The whole thing went on for about 3 months. Every day, some new variation of the same slur. I started dreading going to class. Then one Friday in November, Karen announced she was throwing a party at her house that weekend. She was inviting basically everyone from our program and some people from the other trades too. She made a big show of inviting people individually. When she got to me, she said the dyke could come if she promised not to hit on any stray girls. Her friends thought that was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. I wasn't planning to go. The last thing I wanted was to spend my weekend listening to more of her garbage. But my friends convinced me to change my mind. They said I shouldn't let her keep me away from social events. They promised we'd stick together and leave if things got uncomfortable. So Saturday night, I showed up at Karen's house. It was this huge place in the expensive part of town. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, which explained why she felt comfortable hosting a party. There had to be 50 people there. Music was playing loud enough to annoy the neighbors. People were drinking beer and hanging out in different rooms. I was actually having a decent time with my friends when I decided to find the bathroom. The downstairs one had a line, so I went upstairs. Walking back down the hallway afterward, I passed the kitchen. That's when I saw it sitting on the counter. A can of tuna, just sitting there next to some other random party snacks. I stared at it for a minute and suddenly this idea formed in my head. This perfect, terrible idea. I grabbed the can and looked around for a can opener. Found one in the second drawer I checked. Then I started exploring the house looking for the right spots. The spare bedroom was my first target. I pulled apart one of the curtain rods and stuffed some chunks of tuna deep inside the hollow rod before putting it back together. Then I hit the laundry room and did the same thing with another curtain rod. I was working on hiding tuna in a third location when someone walked in on me. It was this guy from the welding program who I'd seen around but never really talked to. He stood there watching me stuff fish into a curtain rod. I froze, thinking I was completely busted. But then he just smiled and told me to carry on with whatever I was doing. He walked out and never said a word to anyone about what he'd seen. I finished my work and put the empty can in the kitchen trash. Then I rejoined the party like nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the night acting completely normal. Karen made a few more comments about me being there, but I just ignored her like usual. The real entertainment started the following week at school. Monday morning, Karen looked tired. She had dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept well. By Tuesday, she was complaining to her friends about some weird smell in her house. She said it started Sunday morning and they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. She mentioned that her boyfriend thought maybe something had died in the walls, but they'd looked everywhere and couldn't find anything. By Wednesday, she looked desperate. She told people they'd cleaned every room in the house. They checked all the air vents and looked under every piece of furniture. She said the smell was getting worse and driving them crazy. I had to bite my tongue to keep from smiling when I heard these conversations. Watching her get more frustrated every day was incredibly satisfying. The complaints continued for weeks. Karen would corner anyone who'd listen and tell them about this mysterious stench taking over her house. She talked about hiring professional pest control to look for dead animals. She mentioned her boyfriend wanting to tear open walls to find the source. She described the smell as something rotting, but said they'd searched every inch of every room. She complained that her mom was furious because guests kept commenting on the awful odor. By the third week, Karen looked like she was having a breakdown. She said they'd spent over $300 on cleaning supplies and air fresheners. Nothing was working. She mentioned that her parents were threatening to hire contractors to rip apart the house if they couldn't solve the problem. Her boyfriend was starting to blame her for somehow causing the smell. They were fighting about it constantly. Watching her stress levels rise as the mystery deepened was the best entertainment I'd had all semester. This girl, who thought it was hilarious to call me names every day, was now losing sleep over a smell she couldn't identify. The irony was perfect. During the fourth week, Karen started missing classes. She said she couldn't concentrate because of the situation at home. Her grades started slipping. She looked exhausted every day. Her little group of friends was getting tired of hearing about her smell problem. I noticed she stopped making comments about me entirely. She was too distracted by her own problems to focus on bothering anyone else. After about a month and a half, the complaints suddenly stopped. I figured the tuna had finally dried out enough that the smell faded away. But for those 6 weeks when Karen was dealing with her mystery stink situation, I got to watch karma work its magic. She never found out it was me, and she never called me names again after that. The stress of her smelly house crisis seemed to break her habit of picking on people. Maybe she realized that life could be unpleasant enough without adding to other people's problems. Or maybe she was just too tired to keep up her mean girl routine. Either way, I finished the rest of trade school without any more harassment from her. The guy who caught me hiding the tuna became a good friend. He never told anyone what he'd seen, but sometimes he'd give me a knowing look when Karen was complaining about her mysterious smell. I graduated that spring and got a job with a local electrical company. Karen ended up dropping out before finishing the program. Apparently, the stress of her home situation affected her grades too much to recover. My husband and I have been married for 8 years, and one thing I've learned is that he's terrible at planning ahead. He puts things off until the last possible second and then expects everyone else to drop everything to accommodate him. Usually it's small stuff that I can work around, but this time was different. The whole mess started because of something that happened to his father last year. His dad had ignored some health symptoms for months and ended up in the emergency room with a serious colon issue. It was a real wake-up call for the whole family. After that scare, my husband finally started taking his own health more seriously and began seeing a doctor regularly. Back in September, he went for his annual checkup. The doctor told him he needed to get a colonoscopy done. Pretty routine stuff for a guy in his 40s, especially given his family history. The doctor handed him the paperwork and told him to call the clinic to schedule it. That paperwork sat on our kitchen counter for weeks. Every few days I point to it and ask if he'd called yet. He kept telling me he would do it tomorrow and that he'd been too busy. I told him that he'd been saying the same thing for weeks. September turned into October. The paperwork was still sitting there, now buried under mail and other random stuff. I was getting frustrated because I work in healthcare and I know how these things go. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to get an appointment when you actually need it. I kept telling him he really needed to call about that colonoscopy because these appointments book up fast. He kept promising he would call that week but never followed through. By November, I was starting to worry about more than just his health. We'd had a rough year financially with some unexpected home repairs, but we'd finally managed to hit our insurance deductible. That meant any medical procedures would be covered at 100% if he got them done before the end of the year. Come January, we'd be back to paying out of pocket until we hit the new deductible. I explained to him that we'd hit our deductible for this year, and if he got the procedure done before December 31st, it wouldn't cost us anything. But if he waited until next year, we'd be looking at probably $2,000 out of pocket. He kept saying okay, and that he'd call tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. Week after week, we had the same conversation. Finally, last Monday, he comes home from work with this big announcement. He told me the good news was that he'd finally scheduled the colonoscopy. When I asked him when it was, he said December 19th. My stomach dropped. We'd been planning our Christmas trip to Nebraska for months. His family was expecting us. We'd already bought plane tickets, and I'd taken time off work. December 19th was right in the middle of our travel window. I pointed out that was when we were supposed to be in Nebraska. He said he figured we'd just leave after the procedure and drive there that evening. I told him that was a 7-hour drive, and if we left after his appointment, we'd be driving in the dark. I explained that I can't see well at night and asked if he could reschedule for after the new year. He refused, saying we'd lose too much money if we waited. I was annoyed, but I figured maybe we could work something out. Then he made it worse. He told me he'd actually called back and moved it to December 17th to give us more time before we traveled. But then he said I'd need to pick him up at 12:30. I told him I couldn't do that because December 17th was one of my busiest days at school. I teach 4th grade, and December is absolutely crazy. The kids are wound up about the holidays. Parents are stressed about winter break, and there's a million things to wrap up before vacation. December 17th was particularly bad because I had parents coming in to help with a big art project. I was running the class holiday party, and I had a parent conference scheduled after school. I explained that I had parents helping with projects that day, plus the holiday party and a conference, so I couldn't just leave. He said it was only 30 minutes, and I should just step out and come back. I told him it wasn't just 30 minutes because he'd be going under anesthesia. I'd need to be there when he woke up and stay with him. I asked what would happen if there were complications or if it took longer than expected. He accused me of being rigid and inflexible. He said if it was an emergency, I'd figure it out. I pointed out that this wasn't an emergency but poor planning on his part. The argument kept escalating. He accused me of not caring about his health. I pointed out that all of my school commitments had been scheduled weeks before his appointment, and he hadn't bothered to check with me first. He claimed he couldn't call me during the day to ask about my schedule. I told him he could have asked when I got home since I'm usually home by 3:30. He insisted the clinic closed early, which was obviously not true, but he was sticking to his story. He kept saying I should just figure it out because he would do this for me. I told him he wouldn't give me 1 week's notice for something that required taking a whole day off work. The conversation went in circles for an hour. Finally, I'd had enough. I told him to reschedule it for January and that I didn't care if we had to pay more because at this point, there weren't many options with the holidays anyway. He refused and told me to figure it out. I said I wasn't figuring anything out because he created this problem and could solve it himself. That's when he really lost it. He called me a piece of garbage and said family comes first, and I obviously didn't give a damn about him. He walked out of the room and hasn't spoken to me since. 2 days of complete silent treatment. While he was busy pouting, I decided to do some investigating. I called his clinic to see what other options were available. Turns out they had several January appointments open. I also discovered something interesting. The insurance company has a grace period for procedures scheduled before year-end but performed in early January. They still count toward the previous year's deductible. But yesterday something happened. His boss called looking for him because he'd missed an important year-end meeting. A meeting that was scheduled for December 17th, the same day as his procedure. Apparently this meeting determines year-end bonuses, and missing it could cost him thousands of dollars. When I told him about the call, he suddenly became very interested in rescheduling. He said maybe January would be better after all. I asked him what changed his mind, but he didn't really answer. he rescheduled for January 8th. The insurance confirmed it would still be fully covered, and he'll get his full bonus. He still hasn't apologized for calling me names or giving me the silent treatment, but at least now I know exactly where I stand on his priority list. I brought my golden retriever with me to my new home. He's getting older and has developed some anxiety issues since the move. The vet said it's normal for dogs to bark more when they're adjusting to new surroundings. The problem started about 2 weeks after I settled in. My dog would bark during the day when I was at work, usually for short periods. I didn't think much of it until my next-door neighbor knocked on my door one evening. She was a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expression that screamed trouble. She stood on my porch with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. She told me that my dog was disrupting the entire neighborhood with his constant barking. I apologized and explained that he was still adjusting to the move. I promised to look into some solutions. Karen wasn't interested in reasonable approaches. She demanded that I get rid of the dog or she would make sure it got taken away. I told her that my dog was family to me and I wouldn't get rid of him, but I promised to work on the barking issue. She said we would see about that and walked off. I started researching ways to help with my dog's anxiety. I bought him some calming treats and started leaving the radio on during the day to help him feel less alone. Over the next week, Karen escalated things. She would stand at the fence between our yards and bang pots together whenever my dog made any noise. She'd shout at him through the fence, which only made him more anxious and bark more. I tried talking to her again, but she slammed her door in my face. Then the complaints started coming. First, she called the homeowners association about noise violations. I explained the situation to them and showed proof that I was working with a dog trainer. They gave me a reasonable timeline to address the issue. Karen wasn't satisfied with reasonable solutions. She started calling the city's animal control office multiple times a day. They sent someone out twice, and both times the officer found nothing wrong. My dog wasn't barking excessively according to city ordinances, and I was clearly making efforts to address the minor issue. But Karen wanted immediate results, and she wanted my dog gone. Last morning I was getting ready for work when I heard sirens outside. I looked through my window and saw 2 police cars racing down our street. My first thought was that someone had been robbed or hurt. I stepped outside to see if I could help, but the cars stopped right in front of Karen's house. She came running out of her front door, waving her arms. She told the officers that she thought the robbers might kill her. The sheriff who got out of the first car looked confused. He was a tall man with graying hair who seemed like he'd dealt with plenty of difficult situations before. He asked her about the reported robbery and where the suspects were. Karen admitted that it wasn't exactly a robbery, but claimed there was a serious crime happening. When the sheriff asked what kind of crime, she pointed at my house and said that my dog had been terrorizing her for weeks. She demanded that the officers put the dog down immediately. She had lied to emergency services about being robbed just to get police attention for a minor noise complaint. The sheriff's expression shifted from concern to annoyed. He told Karen that she had called 911 and reported an active robbery just to get them there for a dog barking complaint. Karen insisted that this was a serious matter and that my animal was a menace that needed to be destroyed right now. The sheriff explained that filing a false police report was a crime and that she had wasted emergency resources that could have been needed for actual emergencies. I decided to speak up at this point. I introduced myself as the dog's owner and explained that he did bark sometimes during the day, but I was working with a trainer to address it. I mentioned that animal control had already been there twice and found no violations. The sheriff asked how long the barking typically lasted. I told him it was usually just a few minutes at a time when my dog heard unfamiliar sounds, and that the vet said it was anxiety from the recent move. The sheriff nodded and turned back to Karen. He explained that what she had described didn't constitute grounds for putting down an animal and that she had also committed a serious offense by lying to emergency dispatch. Karen demanded that he do something about my dog right now. The sheriff told her he was going to let her off with just a warning this time, but if she filed another false police report, she would be arrested. She started shouting about her rights as a taxpayer and how the police weren't doing their jobs. The sheriff remained professional. He told her that the conversation was over and instructed her to go back inside her house. He turned to walk back to his patrol car, and that's when Karen completely lost it. She lunged forward and dug her fingernails deep into his shoulder, right through his uniform shirt. I watched in shock as she drew blood. The sheriff spun around immediately and grabbed her wrists. He told her she was under arrest for assault on a law enforcement officer. Karen screamed that he couldn't arrest her because she was the victim. The sheriff advised her that she had the right to remain silent and suggested she use it. Within seconds, she was in handcuffs. She continued screaming about injustice and demanding to speak to his supervisor as he walked her to the patrol car. The other officer helped get her into the back seat while she thrashed around like a toddler having a meltdown. The sheriff told me he would need a statement about the ongoing harassment. I agreed to provide one and asked if his shoulder was okay. He said he'd had worse and that Karen clearly had some serious anger management issues. When the patrol car drove away with Karen still shouting from the back seat, several neighbors came out of their houses. Everyone had been dealing with her complaints and demands about various things for months. One elderly man mentioned that she'd tried to get his bird feeder removed because it attracted too many noisy birds. 3 days later, I found out that Karen had been evicted. Turns out she was renting her house too, and assaulting a police officer was grounds for immediate lease termination according to her rental agreement. I've been riding the bus to downtown Philadelphia every Thursday for my physical therapy appointments. About 8 months ago, I hurt my back at work lifting boxes, and now I had to go to therapy twice a week. My insurance covered most of it, but I still had to pay $25 each visit out of pocket. My car had been having transmission problems, and the repair estimate was over $800. Between that and my medical bills, I decided public transportation was my best option for now. The number 42 bus ran every 30 minutes during rush hour, and it usually took about 25 minutes to get downtown. I gotten into a routine of catching the 8:15 a.m. bus, which got me there with plenty of time for my 9 o'clock appointment. The Thursday started off normal enough. I grabbed my coffee and headed to the bus stop at 8:10 a.m. like always. The morning was cold and I could see my breath in the air. A few other regular commuters were already waiting when I got there. The bus pulled up right on schedule, and I found a seat near the middle. We picked up more passengers at each stop, and by the time we reached the downtown area, the bus was completely packed. People were standing in the aisles, holding onto the overhead rails. When we approached 15th and Market Street, I started making my way toward the front. This was the main hub where probably half the bus got off, and just as many people were always waiting to board. It was the worst bottleneck on the entire route. I positioned myself near the exit door, gripping the metal pole when the bus came to a stop. Through the windows, I could see at least 15 people crowded around the door. They were all pressed up close, some of them actually touching the bus door before it even opened. The driver pulled the handle, and the accordion door folded open with that familiar hiss sound. Immediately, the crowd outside surged forward like they were rushing into a concert. Instead of waiting for people to get off first, they pushed right up to the door opening. It created a complete human wall blocking our exit. I stood there for a moment, watching this mess unfold. The people behind me on the bus were getting restless. Someone behind me said they were going to be late for work. Another person asked why nobody was moving. I realized there was no choice but to push through this crowd. The alternative was standing on the bus forever while these people figured out basic courtesy. I took a deep breath and stepped off the bus into the mass of bodies. I said, "Excuse me," several times while trying to squeeze through. There was literally no room to move without bumping into someone. People were packed together so tightly that even turning my body slightly meant making contact with multiple people. When I shifted to my left to get around one person, I accidentally brushed against a woman there. She barely looked up from her phone and just moved slightly to make a little more room. Then when I turned to navigate around someone else, my backpack lightly touched the woman on my right. The woman on my right immediately spun around and looked at me like I just slapped her. She was probably in her mid-40s wearing an expensive-looking navy blue business suit. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she carried a leather purse that probably cost more than I made in a week. Her face was twisted into this expression of pure outrage. She started yelling at me about watching where I was going. She called me clumsy and said I had no right to push people around. Her voice was loud enough that everyone in the immediate area turned to stare at us. I stopped moving and turned to face her directly. I asked her what exactly she expected me to do in this situation. I said I couldn't fly over the crowd because my broom was currently in the shop. I added that if my broom were working properly, I wouldn't need to take public transportation. The moment I said that, I heard someone behind me start to laugh, then someone else joined in. Within seconds, people all around us were chuckling and smiling. Even some of the people still trying to board the bus were grinning. Karen's face turned bright red when she realized the crowd was laughing at her, not with her. She looked around frantically, seeing all these amused faces staring at her. She said this wasn't funny and that I had deliberately bumped into her on purpose. A man in a work uniform standing near us spoke up. He said we were all bumping into each other, and that's what happens when people block the exit. A woman pushing a stroller added that maybe Karen should let people get off before trying to get on. Karen protested that she wasn't blocking anything. She insisted she was just standing there, waiting like everyone else. Another commuter pointed out that she was standing directly in front of the door. Someone else mentioned that this happens every day because people don't follow basic bus etiquette. The laughter was getting louder now. People were genuinely entertained by the whole situation. Even the bus driver had leaned forward to see what was happening. Karen realized she wasn't getting any support from the crowd. She declared that we were all just as rude and inconsiderate as I was. She said this whole city was full of terrible people with no manners. She shot me one final angry look, like she was trying to burn a hole through my head with her eyes. I just shrugged and told her to have a wonderful day. I turned back around and continued making my way through the crowd. Interestingly, people actually started making more room for me now. They were stepping aside slightly and creating a clearer path. I could hear Karen behind me, still complaining loudly to anyone within earshot. She was going on about rude commuters and how the city was going downhill. Most people were just ignoring her and focusing on getting where they needed to go. By the time I made it through the crowd and onto the sidewalk, I looked back toward the bus. Karen was still standing near the door, but she seemed to have given up on actually boarding. She was frantically waving her hands while talking to some poor woman who was clearly just trying to mind her own business. The woman she was talking to kept looking around like she wanted to escape. The whole incident had probably taken less than 3 minutes, but it felt like the most entertaining part of everyone's morning commute. When I walked away toward my physical therapy appointment, I could still hear occasional laughter from the crowd behind me. About half a block down the street, I turned around to check on the situation. The bus was pulling away from the stop, heading to its next destination. I could see Karen still standing on the sidewalk, apparently having missed her ride completely. She was frantically checking her phone, probably looking up the schedule for the next bus. Given that it was rush hour, she'd probably have to wait another 15 to 20 minutes. I needed a job when my boyfriend and I moved to the city for his graduate program. The animal clinic was hiring for a receptionist position, and the pay would cover my share of our small apartment rent. I'd always loved animals, so it seemed like a good fit. The clinic was small with only 3 doctors on staff. Our schedule stayed packed from morning until night. Getting a vet appointment in this city is nearly impossible. Most places book out 3 weeks in advance, and we were no different. People called daily begging for same-day appointments. I had to tell them the earliest opening was usually 2 weeks out. Most pet owners understood when I explained the situation. They'd complain a bit but would book the appointment and move on. I thought I'd handled every type of difficult client until that afternoon 2 years ago. The phone rang around 2 in the afternoon. I answered and asked how I could help. A woman demanded an appointment that same day for her dog's wellness check and vaccines. I asked for her dog's information and pulled up her file. Her dog was due for annual vaccines, but nothing was urgent. The last visit was over a year ago, which meant she'd had plenty of time to schedule this appointment. I checked our schedule and told her our next available appointment was the following Monday at 10 in the morning. She said that wouldn't work and insisted she needed to be seen that day. I explained that all three doctors were fully booked and the earliest opening was next week. She told me she was traveling the next day and needed to board her dog. The boarding facility required current vaccines. I apologized for the timing and offered to put her on our cancellation list. If anyone canceled their appointment that day, I would call her right away. I also suggested she try the emergency clinic across town since they sometimes handled urgent vaccine appointments. That's when she started screaming. She yelled about how ridiculous this was. She said she'd been a client for 2 years. She shouldn't have to go anywhere else. I tried to explain that I understood her frustration but didn't have any openings. Our doctors were already running behind schedule that day. She demanded that I squeeze her in between appointments or during lunchtime. I told her our doctors didn't take lunch breaks because the schedule was so tight. They ate between patients when they had a few minutes. She then told me to call the next appointment and reschedule them. She was sure they could wait another day. I explained that I couldn't reschedule another client's appointment since that wouldn't be fair to them. The next client had scheduled their appointment 2 weeks ago. She argued that this was an emergency. I pointed out that a wellness check and routine vaccines weren't considered an emergency. Preventive care should have been scheduled in advance. She snapped at me not to tell her what was an emergency. She called me just a receptionist. She demanded to speak to my manager. I told her I was the only front desk staff that day. Our manager was assisting in surgery, but I'd be happy to have her call back later. She said this was unacceptable. She announced she was coming to the clinic right away. I tried to explain that showing up wouldn't change our availability. She insisted we'd see about that. Then she said something that made my jaw drop. She demanded I give her the contact information for our next appointment so she could call them herself. I actually laughed because I thought she had to be joking. I asked her to repeat what she'd said. She told me to give her the phone number for whoever had the next appointment. She would explain the situation and ask them to reschedule. I told her I absolutely could not give out another client's personal information. That would violate their privacy and probably several laws. She argued that she wasn't asking for their address, just their phone number. I told her I could not and would not give her any other client's contact information for any reason. She called our clinic useless. She threatened to report us to the veterinary board and contact her lawyer. She said she'd leave bad reviews everywhere. I told her she was welcome to file any complaint she felt necessary. I asked if there was anything else I could help with. She warned me to wait until she got there because we'd see how helpful I was then. She slammed the phone down. I sat there trying to process what had just happened. I dealt with pushy clients before, but nothing like this. The idea that she wanted me to bump another client's appointment was wild enough, but asking for their personal contact information so she could harass them herself was on another level. I made a note in her file about the conversation. I warned my manager when she came out of surgery. I also gave the other front desk staff a heads up in case she called back. About an hour later, Karen showed up with her dog. She walked straight to the front desk, acting like she had an appointment. The waiting room was full of other clients with their pets. She announced loudly that she was there for her appointment. I reminded her that we had no availability that day. She was welcome to wait in case of a cancellation, though. She said she'd driven all the way down. She demanded we see her dog that day. Her voice got louder and other clients started staring. I repeated that while I understood her frustration, our schedule hadn't changed since we spoke an hour earlier. She demanded to speak to a manager, then a doctor. Then she threatened to leave bad reviews online. She stood at my desk for 20 minutes arguing while other clients tried to check in around her. Some clients looked uncomfortable, and one family with young kids moved to seats farther away. My manager came out and repeated everything I'd already told her. Karen kept ranting about how she'd never come back. We'd lost a customer forever. She said we didn't deserve her business anyway. She complained that the emergency clinic would charge her triple what we charged. She blamed us for her having to pay emergency prices. That's when one of our regular clients spoke up from the waiting area. She asked Karen if she hadn't just said she was traveling the next day and wouldn't be back for a while. The regular client pointed out that she was threatening to never return to a place she wasn't planning to come back to anyway because of her travel plans. That made perfect sense according to the regular client. Karen just stared at her. She realized how ridiculous she sounded. She grabbed her dog and walked out without another word. The waiting room went quiet for a moment. Then the regular client who'd spoken up shook her head and said some people just don't plan ahead. Several other clients nodded in agreement. The rest of the day went smoothly. We never saw Karen again. About a week later, my manager told me Karen had indeed left a bad review online. She complained about our terrible customer service and how we refused to accommodate her emergency. The review made it clear she'd had over a year to schedule the appointment. Other reviews responded pointing out that poor planning on her part didn't constitute an emergency on ours. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.